Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster Bundle, or Collection, or Anniversary Collection. Whatever name you happen to find it under, it's the first 6 Final Fantasy games in their Pixel Remaster forms. And buying them in the collection does get you a slight discount over buying them individually. Although, depending on your fandom for the series, you may prefer to just pick up your favorites. But anyway, we're gonna talk about these games, and we're going to go in their chronological order, because that makes the most sense. I thought about doing them in the order they actually came to the West in, but it just makes more sense to start with one and end at 6. So, starting with Final Fantasy. And first and foremost, this one is infinitely preferable to playing the original 8-bit version. Attacks don't miss if the enemy is already gone, and spells don't have a maximum of 9 casts. And, as will be for all of the games in this collection, the translation here is much better than previously. Other than that, we have a pretty simple jrpg, being rather similar to Dragon Quest II, released earlier by Enix. However, where that game only had 3 playable characters, this game allowed you to choose your own party, and a party of 4. And what classes you take at the beginning very much determine the difficulty of this game. People used to debate what the best party to take was, and in a lot of ways that's a matter of opinion. I've always been a fan of taking 2 fighters, black mage and a white mage. Relatively expensive party, but also gives you a fairly easy experience. Of course, midway through this game, your characters grow up, or at least change their classes, and just become a better version of whatever they started as. There are a few oddities in this game. At one point, you actually go up to a space station apparently left behind by some ancient civilization. The game also hinges on a completely nonsensical time travel element, but this game did set up a lot of what Final Fantasy would become in the future. You have your 4 elemental crystals here, and powerful elemental monsters associated with them. I would have preferred if this version would have had an MP system as opposed to the number of casts per level of spell, but I understand this version was supposed to be about going back to the original but improving it, and it is very much successful at that goal. Not the best game in this collection, but certainly one worth playing. Final Fantasy II. This first came to the West on the PlayStation 1, in a bundle with the original Final Fantasy, and it's been released that way more than once. If you're a longtime viewer of this channel, you might notice that this is the only game in this collection I've not reviewed separately, and that is because it has mechanics entirely different from every other Final Fantasy, and I simply can't stand them, or playing this game for more time than it takes to get the barest possible minimum of footage. So what's my problem exactly? Well, first, there is not a traditional leveling scheme here. Instead, every action taken in battle will have some effect on your stats after the battle. The problem is, every action makes something go up, and something else go down. And this applies to everything. Their skill with different weapon types, their base stats, the effectiveness of magic, etc. So, you end up having characters that are hyper-specialized for certain things. Or, if you try to balance everything, you end up with characters that are terrible. And it doesn't help matters that you have 3 permanent party members, and 1 that keeps changing. Don't go and waste anything valuable on the rotating 4th character. Outside of this, there's another element that makes the actual story hard to enjoy. Instead of NPCs being straightforward with their dialogue, you have to remember keywords and use them to trigger them to say things. On your first playthrough, this will waste a huge amount of your time. And it's a real shame because the story here is actually pretty good, and is quite a bit more complex than what was in the first game. But the keyword system makes it very difficult to actually enjoy. Thankfully, the unique leveling mechanics and completely unnecessary keyword system do not return in any of the other games in this collection. If you were going to skip one game in this collection, I recommend skipping Final Fantasy II. I don't know that it's the worst Final Fantasy out there, but it's definitely in my bottom 3. But anyway, let's move on to the next game. Final Fantasy III, the last of the 8-bit Final Fantasies. And thankfully, a return to form for the series. Regular leveling is back. Talking to NPCs is no longer painful, and we have the series' first attempt at a class system. And as valiant an attempt as it is, it's also a very flawed attempt, as there is no way to hybridize your classes. And you don't actually master a class, you instead just gain proficiency in that class. So when you get classes that are obvious upgrades, they actually aren't as good as the one you've been using. The way that's set up, it means you're not going to use the vast majority of classes. The game balances this by forcing you to use particular classes in particular dungeons. And that is very frustrating, as a class system gives you an immense amount of freedom in theory, but then strips that freedom from you completely for entirely arbitrary reasons. Beyond that, this game returns to the idea of elemental crystals, and it also introduces the idea that you're the light warriors, and there's a corresponding team of dark warriors out there. Which is a very interesting idea that should have really been expanded upon, but never was. This game also has a weird fixation on teasing you with modes of transport. I mean, the first time it happens, it's kind of funny, but when it's time number 3, it's like, seriously, how many more times are we doing this? The last dungeon of this game is outright unreasonable unless you do a completely different optional dungeon, which rewards you with the 2 best classes in the game. If you don't get those 2 classes, the last part of this game is just ridiculous. Overall, this one does feel a lot more modern than the first 2 games. And this Pixel Remaster is the only way to play it officially that actually is something like the original 8-bit version. There is a 3D remake of this that I do not recommend. This is certainly an interesting title, and definitely worth giving a try to at least, even if you don't finish it in this collection. Now we move on to the point where the series jumped into the 16-bit world. And all 3 of the next games are absolutely worth playing to completion. Final Fantasy IV. And I'm not going to try and hide it, this is my personal favorite out of these 6. And I think this one, much like Final Fantasy II, was really putting story first in what it was doing. As throughout this game, you have no say in who is in your party, which can lead you to having a less than ideal party for a situation, as every character has a class and a defined role. And there is nothing you can do to change their class. With the sole exception of Cecil, the main character, who does change classes at about the quarter way through mark. He goes from being a Dark Knight to being a Paladin, which means he does lose his Darkness attack that can end random encounters in one move. But he overall becomes much more powerful, so I guess it's worth it. Even though they were trying for story very hard in this one, there are certain events that happen that do get your eyes rolling. I mean, how many chances do you realistically give the guy that keeps betraying you? I know Cecil and Kane were longtime friends, but there has to be a limit on how many shenanigans you're gonna put up with. And then, much like the first Final Fantasy, in the last part of the game, there are suddenly a bunch of sci-fi elements out of nowhere. You get a spaceship and go to the moon, where there are aliens. And Cecil is apparently half alien. Kind of weird how all these people living in a medieval fantasy world do not bat an eye at any of this information. There's also a lot of interesting optional things you can do. Go to a land where all the summoned monsters live, fight a dragon on the moon, and find out what's become of several party members that have left your party. Sadly, none of them decide to rejoin you because you are stuck with the party you are stuck with. Yes, this game is silly and a little limited compared to some of the others in this series. And a lot of my fondness here is based purely in nostalgia. And its characters being so defined by their classes is heavily contrasted against the next game here, which is, of course, Final Fantasy V, the second attempt at a class system. And it works out a lot better than the first time around, as now you have some ability to hybridize classes. The game at no point forces you to use any particular class, and every class in this game can be mastered, and there's actually good reason to do so. because every class that you master gives you stat bonuses when you're without a class, or a freelancer. So, unlike in 3, you actually have a reason to play all the classes. You have a much smaller cast of characters this time, only a total of 5 playable characters, 4 of which that you get right at the start, and then one of them gets replaced later on. But conveniently, all the levels and abilities gained by the party member you lose get transferred into the new one, which is entirely a gameplay conceit, as it doesn't really make any sense logically, but if you didn't do that, you would have one party member you'd have to completely start from scratch on, and that would just be terrible. This game does take some interesting turns, like when you go to a second world, and later still, when the two worlds combine with one another. And everything that's happening is all because a tree wants to not be around anymore. Because Exdeath, the big bad of this game, is immortal, and apparently is just done with that. So it's decided that ending the universe is the most logical way to end his problems. Needless to say, that doesn't work out well for him, because, well, our heroes prevent that. I'm sure you never saw that coming. I think that this is definitely the easiest game in this collection, and that is entirely because of how exploitable the class system really is in this game. Even if you're not mastering every single class to make super characters, just getting the right combination of abilities completely destroy the challenge in this game. And there are multiple combinations of abilities that can lead to that outcome. Speaking of overpowered abilities, it's time to talk about Final Fantasy VI. Before 7 came out, this was the one everybody talked about and loved. And personally, I'd still take this game over 7. But starting out, you'll notice this game does something different than any other game in this collection. Instead of a medieval fantasy world, we're in kind of a steampunk kind of world. Machines are definitely a part of everyday life in this world. You actually start out the game wearing mech suits, albeit briefly, and when you see ships at town ports, they look as if they're maybe steam-powered. And it might seem like a small change, but this actually makes the world come off entirely differently than in previous games. And also setting this game apart is that it has still to this day the highest number of playable characters at 14, 2 of which are hidden characters. 2 more of which you can also be locked out of getting. The story here starts out fairly cliché, but gets more interesting as it goes on. As you start out, you have the evil Empire fighting the Resistance, but as we go on, we find out that not everyone in the Empire is quite on the same page. And then we find out what espers actually are and how to actually use them, and that there's a whole other world full of espers, though sadly we don't really get to go there. And then, at the exact halfway point, we find out the Empire and the Resistance don't matter at all, because the evil clown general has decided to betray the Emperor and take godlike power for himself. And seeing how the world is changed after this point, literally called the World of Ruin, it's clear that clown getting this amount of power was not a good thing. Early on in this game, each of the characters you get feels very different because they all have different skills and are clearly intended to do different things. But then once you unlock espers and magicite, everyone can suddenly have magic and be very, very powerful. And after that point, it doesn't really matter what party members you have with you, it's just sort of a matter of who you'd rather see in your party. And I do get that it's a story necessity for magic to be kind of an overpowered thing in this world, but in terms of gameplay, once magic becomes an element in play, the game ceases to have any challenge to it. It's also a little strange that everything in the Empire is just gone in the second half of the game. They seem like they're a fairly large military force in the first half of the game. So wouldn't logically there be pockets of it left somewhere? It doesn't really matter, and that wouldn't really help the story in any way. It's just something that's been bothering me ever since I first played this way back when. The end part of this game is interesting because it does attempt to make you use all of your characters. As to do the last dungeon, you break up into 3 parties. So assuming you didn't get locked out of using Mog and Shadow, you could actually have all 12 with you here. And the fact you use all 12 does encourage you to actually use and level all of your characters. As most games that have a huge cast of characters like this, you usually still end up just using whichever ones you happen to be fond of. But here, you actually have a mechanic that shows yes, you really did need to level everyone. At least if you wanted this last dungeon to go smoothly at all. And that is the Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster Bundle. A great set of games, and a pretty decent value, all things considered. But I'm kind of mixed on these Pixel remasters actually existing, because there's been superior versions of most of these games released previous to this, like the PSP versions of 1, 2, and 4, arguably the GBA versions of 5 and 6, but at least the Pixel Remaster did give us 3 in a somewhat better form, so there's that. I do wonder if we're going to get other versions of these games again, or are the Pixel Remasters just going to be remade for newer hardware as it's released? Only time will tell, I guess. Please do subscribe, comment, like, and tell your friends.